Today, we read the story of the Red Sea as a triumph. We see it in children's Bibles with neat, blue walls of water standing perfectly still like glass. We sing about it in our worship. We use it as a comforting metaphor for God making a way when there seems to be no way. And all of those things are true. But to the Israelites standing on the sandy shore that day, the water was not a miracle yet. It was an execution wall. They had just walked out of Egypt. For the first time in 400 years, they were breathing free air. They were carrying the wealth of their oppressors. They were following a towering pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The ancient promise of a new land was finally, incredibly, becoming real. But then, God gave Moses a very strange set of directions. In Exodus chapter 14, God tells Moses to change course. He does not tell Israel to march straight toward the open wilderness. He does not lead them along the safest, most logical coastal trade route toward Canaan. Instead, God tells them to camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. To a military strategist, this is madness. God was taking hundreds of thousands of civilians, along with their children, their elders, and their livestock, and marching them straight into a geographical trap. He placed them in a blind alley. They were backed up against a massive, uncrossable body of water. There was no bridge. There was no fleet of ships waiting to carry them across the waves. There was rough terrain on either side, and the sea at their backs. They had nowhere to run. And the text tells us exactly why God did this. God tells Moses that Pharaoh will look at Israel's erratic movements and assume they are lost. Pharaoh will think the wilderness has shut them in. The trap was set, and the bait worked. The Egyptian war machine mobilized. Pharaoh gathered 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, and an entire army of cavalry and foot soldiers. The full, terrifying weight of the ancient world's greatest empire rode out into the desert to reclaim its property. When the Israelites heard the thunder of hooves and saw the dust rising on the horizon, they did not feel triumphant. They did not expect a sea to split. They were completely paralyzed with terror. They cried out to Moses in panic, asking if there were not enough graves in Egypt, that he had to bring them out to die in the wilderness. They told him it would have been better to serve the Egyptians in bondage than to be slaughtered in the sand. This is where most modern readers rush forward to get to the deliverance. We want to get to the part where the wind blows and the waters open. But if we rush past this moment, we miss the tension that sets up the rest of the biblical pattern. God did not accidentally lead his people into a corner. He deliberately placed them there. He bypassed the safe roads. He engineered a scenario where their backs were pressed against the cold waters of the sea, and their faces were staring down the weapons of a furious king. He designed a moment where human survival was mathematically impossible. It looks like a terrible mistake. It looks like the Exodus has failed before it has barely begun. God deliberately cornered his own people between an unstoppable army and an uncrossable sea. The question is why? Today, we look at the ocean and see beauty. We build houses next to it. We take vacations on it. We stand on the shore to admire the power of nature. But the ancient world did not see the sea that way. To the ancient Near Eastern mind, the sea was not a place of leisure. It was a place of terror. It was dark, unpredictable, and untamable. It was the realm where humans did not belong, a chaotic space that swallowed ships and destroyed lives. And in the biblical imagination, the turbulent sea represents something even deeper. It is not just water. It is the primary symbol of uncreation. It represents the chaotic forces of anti-life that stand in opposition to God's good and ordered world. To understand what the Israelites were feeling on the shores of the Red Sea, we have to look backward. We have to go all the way back to the second verse of the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, before there was light, before there was dry land, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Hebrew word for this deep is tehom. It describes a wild, dark, watery abyss. It is the raw material of chaos. When God creates the world, he does not destroy the water. He commands it. He gathers it. He sets a boundary for it, pushing the chaotic waters back so that dry, safe, ordered land can emerge. In the biblical story, dry land is the place of human flourishing. The sea is the place of danger. Later biblical writers continue this theme. The poets and prophets often describe the sea as the home of terrifying creatures. In Psalm 74, The writer looks back at the Exodus and says that God divided the sea by his strength and broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. This is not a marine biology lesson. It is a profound theological picture. The sea represents the untamed forces of chaos, destruction, and death. And Yahweh is the only king powerful enough to subdue it. So, when the Israelites are backed up against the Red Sea, they are not just looking at a difficult geographical hurdle. They are looking at the abyss. They are staring directly into the ancient, cosmic symbol of death. And the tension becomes unbearable when you realize who is behind them. Behind them is Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. For generations, Pharaoh has been the human embodiment of chaos. He is the one who enslaved them. He is the one who ordered their baby boys to be drowned in the waters of the Nile River. He is the agent of death. Israel is caught between two forms of uncreation. Behind them is the human force of death, riding in chariots. In front of them is the cosmic force of death, crashing against the shore. They are standing in the narrow space between the beast of the empire and the beast of the sea. To the modern mind, the solution is simple. You find a way around the water, but God's plan was not to go around it. God's plan was to go straight through it. He was not going to rescue them by avoiding the darkness. He was going to rescue them by making them walk directly into the heart of the abyss. To the Israelites, stepping into the sea was stepping into the grave. But God was about to use their deepest fear as their only door to freedom. When all human hope has vanished, Moses steps to the edge of the shoreline. He raises his staff and stretches his hand out over the dark, crashing waves. And Exodus chapter 14, verse 21 tells us that the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. To a modern reader, a strong wind just sounds like heavy weather. It sounds like a practical, meteorological tool God used to physically move millions of gallons of water. But the ancient readers heard something entirely different. They heard an echo. In the Hebrew language, the word used for wind in this passage is ruach. It is a deeply layered word. Depending on the context, ruach can mean wind, it can mean breath, or it can mean spirit. If we rewind the biblical scroll all the way back to the beginning, to the second verse of the Bible, we find this exact same word. In Genesis chapter 1, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the text says that the ruach of God, the Spirit of God, the breath of God, the mighty wind of God was hovering over the face of the chaotic waters. And what happens next in the creation story? God separates the waters. The boundaries of the sea are established, and out of that dark, watery chaos, dry land appears. A safe, ordered space for human life is brought into existence. Now, pause for a second and look at the shores of the Red Sea. Israel is facing the dark abyss of water. Moses stretches out his hand. God sends his ruach, a powerful, rushing wind, sweeping over the face of the deep all through the night. The waters are pushed back and divided, and out of the middle of the chaos, what emerges? Dry land. This is not an accident. The biblical text is not just recording a historical event. It is showing us a massive theological pattern. By repeating the exact imagery and the exact sequence of events from the beginning of the Bible, the writer is making a profound claim. When God brought Israel out of Egypt, he was not just helping a group of slaves escape a bad political situation. He was not merely orchestrating a clever military retreat. He was creating the world all over again. In Genesis, God brought a physical world out of the watery void. Here at the Red Sea, God is bringing a new humanity out of the waters of death. The Exodus is a literal act of new creation. When Pharaoh looked at the Israelites trapped on the beach, he saw a dying nation. He saw a brief rebellion that was about to be violently shut down. But when God looked at Israel trapped by the water, he saw the raw material for a new world. Israel was being born. They were stepping out of the chaos of their past, out of the realm of uncreation, and stepping onto the firm foundation of a new beginning. The old world of slavery was behind them. The new world of God's covenant was waiting on the other side. And the only way to get from the old world to the new world was to let the breath of God push back the grave. The text is quietly showing us that this is not just an escape. It is Genesis chapter 1 happening all over again. Moses stretched out his hand. The wind blew. The path opened. But knowing a path is open and actually stepping into it are two entirely different things. We often picture the crossing of the Red Sea as a bright, sunny, triumphant parade. But the biblical text tells us this happened during the night. It was dark. The only illumination was the burning pillar of fire standing guard between the camp of Israel and the Egyptian army. And the sound must have been absolutely deafening. A supernatural wind was howling through a newly formed canyon of water. Exodus chapter 14, verse 22, says the Israelites went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Hebrew word used for wall in this verse is homa. It is the same word used throughout the Old Testament to describe the massive, impenetrable stone walls that protected ancient fortresses and cities. But water is not stone. It is fluid. It is unimaginably heavy. And by its very nature, it is desperate to collapse back in on itself. Think about what it required for an entire nation of former slaves to step into that corridor. They were not walking on a sturdy bridge far above the danger. They were walking directly across the floor of the abyss. The chaos they had feared was hovering inches away from their shoulders. If the roaring wind stopped, if God withdrew his hand for even a single second, those fluid walls would crash down and the sea would swallow them alive. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of historical details. The dark sea of uncreation was waiting for them. The wind of God pushed it back. The dry land appeared. The pattern of Genesis is holding them safe. This was never just a clever military escape route. It was a terrifying, magnificent walk through the narrow space between life and death. This scene gives us the foundational biblical picture of what it actually means to be saved. Deliverance in Scripture is rarely about being airlifted over the problem. It is almost always about being led safely through the middle of it. Faith is not the absence of danger. It is the willingness to walk into the dark, between the towering walls of uncreation, trusting that the God of heaven is strong enough to hold them back. Every single step the Israelites took on that dry seabed was an act of profound vulnerability. They were completely stripped of all self-reliance. They could not fight the massive walls of water. They could not fight the hundreds of iron chariots behind them. They were entirely dependent on the invisible power of Yahweh to keep the chaos suspended. And step by trembling step, they made it. The elders, the children, the shepherds, all moving through the cold night. Eventually, the first rays of morning light began to break over the eastern horizon. The Israelites began to step onto the far shore, turning around to look back at the roaring corridor they had just survived. And then, the Egyptian war machine drove into the sea. Israel had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, trusting God to hold the walls. But those towering walls of water were not just standing at attention. They were waiting. As the Israelites reached the safety of the far shore, the Egyptian army was still charging through the corridor of dry land. 600 elite chariots, heavily armored soldiers, and the fury of a humiliated empire were driving straight into the abyss. But the text tells us that during the morning watch, God looked down on the Egyptian army through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw them into a panic. He jammed their chariot wheels, making them drive heavily. In the middle of the sea floor, surrounded by towering walls of dark water, the Egyptians suddenly realized the truth. They screamed to one another, telling the army to flee from Israel because Yahweh was fighting for them against Egypt. But it was too late. God speaks to Moses. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 26, God says, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." Notice the deliberate symmetry of the story. When Moses stretched out his hand the first time, it was an act of creation. The wind blew. The dry land appeared. Order was established out of the dark void. Now, Moses stretches out his hand a second time, but this is not an act of creation. It is an act of uncreation. Moses raises his hand as the sun rises, and the text says the sea returned to its normal course. The roaring wind stopped. The invisible force that was holding the massive, unnatural walls of water suspended in the air simply vanished. The walls collapsed. Millions of gallons of dark, heavy water crashed down upon the most powerful army in the ancient world. This was not just a military defeat. It was a cosmic reversal. Egypt was being uncreated. God simply stopped holding the chaos back, and the natural force of death reclaimed the empire of death. And there is a devastating, poetic justice in exactly how this happens. Decades earlier, the throne of Egypt had issued a terrifying decree. Pharaoh had commanded that every Hebrew baby boy be thrown into the waters of the Nile River. He used the water as a weapon of genocide. He used the dark currents to drown the innocent. Pharaoh thought he was the master of the waters. He believed he was the architect of life and death. But here, at the bottom of the Red Sea, God shows Pharaoh who actually rules the deep. The empire that used the water to destroy the helpless is now completely swallowed by the water. The forces of oppression are buried in the very chaos they use to enslave others. Exodus chapter 14, verse 28 says, "The waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained." It is a terrifying image. The unstoppable war machine of the ancient world was erased in an instant. The roaring of the wind, the thunder of iron wheels, and the shouting of the soldiers were abruptly silenced. The sea leveled out. The surface returned to its ancient, dark calm. The chaos had consumed the agents of chaos. But as the morning light washed over the quiet waves, a massive theological shift was happening. Egypt was dead. But what did this mean for the people standing dry and breathing on the other side? Imagine the absolute silence that fell over the eastern shore as the sun finally broke across the sky. The roaring of the east wind had stopped. The thunder of the iron chariot wheels had ceased. The towering, terrifying walls of the abyss had collapsed. For the first time in their lives, the Israelites were completely out of Pharaoh's reach. They were standing on dry ground, breathing free air. And their immediate response was not just relief, it was worship. Exodus chapter 15 records what is traditionally called the Song of the Sea. This is not just a spontaneous, emotional poem. Scholars recognize this as one of the oldest pieces of literature in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is Israel's first great theological statement. Before they receive the law, before they build the tabernacle, before they conquer the promised land, they sing a song that defines exactly who their God is. And the lyrics are incredibly specific. They do not merely thank God for a safe escape route. They sing, "Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea." To understand the weight of those words, you have to remember where these people just came from. They had spent 400 years crushed under the boots of the Egyptian empire. They had been told every single day that Pharaoh was a living god, the divine ruler who maintained cosmic order. The gods of Egypt were supposed to be the undisputed masters of the natural world. But in the ancient Near East, the ultimate test of a god's power was his ability to defeat the chaotic sea. Every surrounding culture had a myth about a storm god battling a chaotic sea monster to establish the world. It was always a violent, exhausting, cosmic struggle. Now look at how Israel describes Yahweh's power over the deep. There is no struggle. There is no celestial battle. Exodus chapter 15, verse 8 says, "At the blast of your nostrils the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea." God does not have to fight the water. He simply breathes. The terrifying abyss that haunted the ancient imagination is not a rival to Yahweh. It is just water. It obeys its maker. This realization completely dismantled the Egyptian worldview. Pharaoh thought he was the architect of life and death. He thought he controlled the forces of the world. But when the true king of the cosmos stepped into the story, Pharaoh's false, oppressive order was swallowed by the very chaos he thought he commanded. This is why the Israelites shout the central, defining question of the song, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders?" The answer was washing up on the shore right in front of them. Absolutely no one. For a brief, shining moment on that beach, Israel understood exactly who was leading them. They saw Yahweh as the supreme king of creation, the one who brings life out of the waters of death. They thought the victory was complete. They thought the Red Sea was the climax of their story. But God was doing something much larger than rescuing one generation from one empire. He was establishing a divine blueprint. The pattern of being saved by walking through the waters of death was not going to stop at the shores of the Red Sea. It was just beginning. For hundreds of years, the people of Israel gathered to retell the story of the Red Sea. They sang the song of Moses. They remembered the wind, the dry land, and the crushing weight of the water falling on the Egyptian empire. They understood it as the defining moment of their national history. But in the first century, the Apostle Paul looked back at that exact same stretch of water and saw something even deeper. He did not just see a historical event. He saw a theological blueprint. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is writing to a group of early Christians, and he says this, "I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." To a modern reader, that wording sounds strange. We know the story of the Exodus. Moses did not stop in the middle of the Red Sea, turn around, and perform a religious ceremony. There was no quiet church service. There was no sprinkling of water. The Israelites were walking in terror through the middle of the night, fleeing from the most powerful army on earth. So why does Paul use the word baptized? To modern ears, baptism is usually a peaceful church tradition, a quick dip in a heated pool, or a small basin of warm water. It is a polite public statement of faith. But Paul is drawing on a much heavier, much more terrifying image. He connects the Christian act of baptism directly back to the dark, roaring, chaotic waters of the abyss. Paul understood the biblical pattern. He knew that Egypt was the old world of slavery, and he knew that the only way God brought his people out of that old world was by forcing them to walk straight through the waters of uncreation. Israel had to go down into the deep. They had to be completely surrounded by the grave. They had to rely entirely on the breath of God to hold the chaos back. And when they emerged on the other side, they were no longer slaves. They were a new creation. Paul is saying that this is exactly what happens in the life of a Christian. The Red Sea is the physical scale model of spiritual salvation. When a person steps into the waters of baptism, they are not just performing a nice ritual, they are stepping into the Red Sea. They are declaring that their old life, their own personal Egypt, their slavery to sin and the forces of anti-life is over. They are walking down into the watery grave. And just like the Egyptian war machine was swallowed by the sea, the old self is buried in the water. The forces that used to enslave you are completely uncreated. They are left at the bottom of the deep. When you come up out of the water, you are stepping onto the dry, firm ground of the eastern shore. You are breathing the free air of a new creation. You are leaving the empire of death behind, and you are stepping into a covenant with the King who defeated the chaos. This completely changes how we are supposed to read the book of Exodus. God did not just part the waters to give ancient Israel a temporary escape route. He was etching a pattern into the physical history of the world. He was showing humanity exactly what salvation would always look like. It would not look like avoiding death. It would look like being led safely through it. But the crossing was never meant to be just a story about ancient Israel. It was preparing the world for a much larger rescue. When you realize that the Red Sea was the blueprint for how God saves the world, the rest of the New Testament begins to open up. Think about how Jesus interacts with water. When a massive storm threatens to drown his disciples on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus does not panic. He stands up in the boat, looks at the raging waters of chaos, and speaks. He commands the wind and the waves to be still, and they obey him. Later, Jesus walks casually across the surface of the dark, turbulent sea in the middle of the night. To a modern reader, these are just impressive displays of power. But to a first-century Jewish reader, whose entire historical imagination was built on the Exodus, these moments are massive theological claims. Jesus is doing exactly what Yahweh did at the beginning of creation, and exactly what Yahweh did at the Red Sea. He is proving that he is the master of the deep. He is the one who subdues the chaos. But the pattern goes one step further. Jesus did not just come to walk on top of the water. He came to go down into it. At the cross, Jesus allowed the ultimate forces of uncreation to completely overwhelm him. He did not ask for a safe road around death. He deliberately walked into the dark, narrow space between the wrath of Rome and the judgment of the grave. He let the heavy, crushing waters of death collapse over his own head. He was buried in the abyss. But on the third day, the breath of God blew through the darkness again. The ultimate sea was divided, and Jesus walked out of the grave on dry ground. He became the firstborn of a new creation, leading a new humanity out of the empire of death and onto the firm foundation of resurrection life. And this is where the entire biblical pattern of the sea finally comes to an end. In the last book of the Bible, The Apostle John is given a vision of the final, restored universe. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." For centuries, people have debated what that verse means. Some people worry that the new earth will not have oceans or shorelines. But John is not talking about marine geography. He is talking about cosmic theology. He is using the ancient biblical vocabulary to say that in God's final, perfect world, the abyss is gone. The chaotic forces of uncreation are permanently erased. There is no more death. There is no more suffering. There is no more darkness waiting to swallow the innocent. The beast of the sea is dead. God has finally and forever established a world where his people are completely safe. Until that day, we still have to cross the sea. We still face the roaring winds. We still have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But we do not have to be afraid of the water, because the God who holds the walls is the one walking with us. If this study helped you see the biblical story with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next discovery. The Red Sea was never just a body of water. It was the terrifying, magnificent space where God proved that the only way to conquer the grave is to walk straight through it.